Okay, well, look, delighted to be with you today to, I suppose, discuss and provide, I suppose, some guidance in relation to PPN hosting arrangements. Just a little bit in terms of my own background. I worked with the community and voluntary sector for the last 25 years. I've worked in local development sector in the last 17 years. I've been in private consultancy sector. I'm also a volunteer on a number of boards, cross-border bodies, and I work with government departments, community and voluntary groups, and councils, and various other organisations across the country, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. I'm based in County Monaghan, and from here we provide a range of services. And over the last few years, we've done quite a bit of work with PPNs and other organisations as well, where challenges have arisen, and trying to work our way through finding a workable solution or maybe modifying what currently is taking place. And I'm a great believer in prevention is better than cure. If you can put in place, I suppose, safeguards to ensure that things hopefully run smoothly. So look, I hope you find webinar informative, and at the end, as Aoife has outlined, there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions. So briefly, what I'm going to cover for the next while is I'm going to look at, I suppose, the context in which we're operating. I'm going to look at the purpose of hosting arrangements, just to recap. Look at, I suppose, a review and analysis of the options, and there are a finite amount of options that are on the table. And going to look at, particularly in relation to third-party hosting arrangements, there have been a number of queries from groups in relation to how you actually manage and run a process. So going to bring you through, I suppose, the selection process guidance on that as well. And then we have questions and answers. And again, a copy of this has been recorded for anybody that can't be with us today. So in terms of the context, Aoife already outlined there's a number of PPNs who are considering a review or change to their current hosting arrangements for a variety of reasons. Maybe what they have isn't just working quite as well as it could, or there have been maybe disputes or disagreements or issues that have been ongoing, and there have been attempts to resolve them, and there's a feeling that maybe there may be a better way. So look, that's one of the key purposes of today. We're going to provide guidance. Again, this webinar isn't part of the PPN handbook. It is basically a guidance provision the department has organised for you to provide you with assistance in terms of you coming up with a decision on this. So 3 options are available. We're going to talk our way through 3 of those. And I suppose the third thing is I've been asked to give an independent, impartial view. I work for PPNs, I work for community and voluntary groups. I sit as a board member on I think 7 at the moment, community and voluntary organisations. And I also do work for local authorities. I also do work for government departments. So I don't have a clear alignment to any of them, and I do work for all of them on a weekly basis. So I'm trying to be as independent and impartial in terms of assessing the views. Some of what I say, some people will agree with, some may disagree, and you're perfectly entitled to do so. But again, that's the purpose of today, to provide a perspective. I suppose an overarching thing to take stock of before we go into the meat of this is that this is not a webinar or the start of a process to try and get large-scale change of hosting arrangements across the country. If what you currently are using, regardless of which mechanism it is working, there's no need to consider change. And that's not the purpose of today, to try and force people down a particular road of change. Okay? If it's working, don't fix it. So, purpose of hosting arrangements, there are 5, I suppose, broad headings. From my experience of working with PPNs, number 1, the host provides a legal structure from which the PPN can operate. It performs the role of the employer, or the resource worker and the support worker, which is there are legal connotations associated with that, and also in terms of employment law, etc. The third one is you need to provide a serviced office, an accessible office for your staff to work and for members of the secretariat or PPN to liaise with staff. So that's the third thing the host would provide. The fourth thing is ultimately the administrative function. So that's processing the invoices, managing the money, doing the payroll, and carrying out those functions, and providing, for example, being an entity to provide insurance, etc. Okay? And then the final one is ultimately to carry out a range of other functions, such as under, the requirements of an employer, the Health and Safety at Work Act, etc. There's reporting. There's ultimately governance requirements as a custodian of public money. Don't know the exact budgets. There's over 100,000, I think, most PPNs, and it's a reasonable amount of public money, and there have to be certain safeguards, checks and balances, audit trail, etc. And the host can provide assistance in ensuring that those are all met to the relevant standards to give, I suppose, an assurance to the department as the ultimate funder that everything is in order. So those are just a recap as to the purpose of the hosting arrangements. So if we look at the different options that are available to you, they are documented in the PPN handbook and are also as a department circular from a number of years ago. And the three options quite simply are hosted within the local authority structure, hosted by an external organisation, which is community organisation, a third party, or the third one is a PPN support company, more commonly known as self-hosting. I suppose there are a small number of self-hosting, and from what I understand, are quite effective around the country at present. So those are the three options, and those are the three options we're going to consider today. So before we consider them, regardless of the hosting arrangement that's to be used, there are two, I suppose, overarching things we need to be conscious of. Number one is that it's an express condition of funding that if you have a third party, whether it's a local authority or a third party host, that the resource worker and support worker, any staff, would operate independently from the local authority or third party host and be answerable to the PPN Secretariat in the performance of their duties. So that's regardless of what hosting arrangements you have. The reporting from a staffing point of view, that is the expectation in reality. And the second thing is to be conscious of that different hosting arrangements have different cost structures associated with them, and the budget will remain the same for core operational costs from a department point of view, regardless. So again, it's the second thing to consider when looking at the different hosting arrangements. It's not the be all and end all, but they are considerations which sometimes people do not necessarily take stock of. If we were to sit back and look at any sort of selection process, I do a lot of recruitment, interviewing, restructuring, mergers, acquisitions, various different types of organizational functions. And the first thing you usually sit down and look at what is your wish list of, in an ideal world, what are the key requirements you would like to be met? So we call them practical considerations. So from a host point of view, as PPN Secretariat members or as staff working for a PPN or as PPN plenary members or the department for that point of view, here are a list, in my opinion, as the key considerations you need to take stock of. Number one, whatever hosting arrangement you have, that it's sustainable. What I mean by that is that it can continue to operate in that format for a reasonable period of time, if not indefinite period of time, that it's effective, that it allows you to perform the core functionality that the PPN was set up to do. And I'm not going to go through the detail of that. You all will be familiar of that in terms of representing the community and voluntary sector interest, advocating, etc., etc. Makes the best use of the limited resources that are available, retains independence of PPN decision making. And I know this particular issue in terms of independence comes up very regularly when I hear about issues in terms of hosting. The independence of PPN decision making is something that is raised, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. Ultimately, you want to ensure that it encourages high levels of engagement from the community and voluntary sector in your county or your operational area, an appropriate level of governance, and that's where we talk about from an accountability, legislative requirements, tax compliance, charity regulator, etc., etc. Whatever is required in terms of reporting that the appropriate levels of governance are there. Decision making can be seamless, that there isn't an impediment created by the hosting arrangement to you making decisions as a PPN in the flat structure that it is. This one possibly some people will argue shouldn't be here. Security for staff, and I think maybe you change it to maybe retention of staff. I think it's important for PPNs that you have a structure that as a minimum, provide some degree of security that you're going to hold on to staff, particularly if you've got good staff that are experienced, that the structure is not an impediment to holding on to them, that they don't feel secure. So while some will argue that shouldn't be on this list, I feel it is consideration because they're a key cog in the wheel of the PPN. And lastly, I feel strongly that, whatever structure you choose, that it doesn't unduly take away from the core functionality of the PPN. PPN has a very heavy workload. It's called upon on many occasions in terms of consultation, representation, etc. And you don't want to create a situation where you're distracting from that core functionality. Okay. So we're going to look at three options. What I've done here is a very simple exercise, maybe an overly simplistic exercise, but I tried to keep it reasonably tight so that we can get through it. So look, in terms of local authority, I've simply done up a table here as to my views, as to pros and cons. I'm sure there are others if we had a debate on this. But from my experience of working with issues and challenges and I suppose opportunities as well in PPNs, here are some of them. So in terms of local authority, look at some of the pros, some of the positives. You have an existing strong governance structure, part of local government. I know for staff members, by and large, for staff members I would have spoken to around the country, I'm sure there are exceptions, there is a feeling of security, of tenure, possible career progression. I know people who have been PPN workers working within local authorities that have subsequently maybe gone on to work in other jobs in local authority as well. There's obviously no company returns or no requirement that's delegated to the local authority administrative function. Health and safety and other requirements in relation to staff, in relation to running events, etc. That all is delegated to local authority. And I suppose the final thing in terms of pros is that the PPN secretariat, the linkage groups, the plenary, particularly the secretariat, can concentrate on policy, on representation, capacity building, and the core functions that you're there to do. Okay, in terms of some of the cons, we call them, basically cons in terms of perceived independence and control. I use the word perceived because perceived independence and control, because I'm not completely sure if there are proper service level agreements and members of understanding. There should be an independence and control there. Another one I suppose I've come across is sometimes public sector led, services, etc., can result in lower levels of community and voluntary engagement. That's not always the case, but it can in some occasions. I've come across a number of occasions with PPNs where there may be a disagreement with the local authority in terms of policy on certain issues, and there has been maybe divided allegiances or else a conflict of interest or just conflict has resulted in that because the local authority is providing the workers and employing the workers, and yet the PPN through the workers is basically questioning some policy, core policy, and there can be issues there. I suppose the other con as well is you're not self-hosting. This is a relationship that needs to be managed and needs to be managed on an ongoing basis between local authority management, who are ultimately the employer of the staff, and the secretary, the PPN. And both of those will change over time. And when personalities change and people change, relationships need to be built from scratch again. Okay, second one, we're going to look at the self-hosting option and some pros and cons here. And again, there are a number of quite effective self-hosting organisations around the country from PPN perspective, and they probably are the exception rather than the rule, but there are some of these at the moment. Pros, perceived independence and control. It's retained within the PPN company. Potential, obviously, usually set up as a CLG and as a charity. There's potential for them in their own right then to apply for funding from other sources. Whereas if the host is a local authority, for example, and there's a fund opens for community and voluntary sector groups, it can't apply. And I suppose a pro of this is there's less potential for conflict of interest with contributions to policy in local authority matters. Maybe the exception, but again, it's another positive of that. I suppose in terms of the cons, there is an additional layer of responsibility for the people who are involved in the PPN, because you will set up a company, usually a CLG company, people will have to sign up as directors, also usually as charity trustees, and you will be responsible as an employer. You will have company returns on an annual basis, the same as any CLG company, of which I'm sure many of you in your own communities are basically directors. There will be charity regulatory authority returns on an annual basis. Not enormous pieces of work, but they all add to the work. Health and safety and other requirements are borne by, I suppose, the directors of the company. And again, PPN secretariat linkage groups, there will be a requirement to divert some time, particularly at the secretariat level, and whoever is basically on the company, to divert time towards running the company as well as the PPN core business. And then individual members need to sign as directors and charity trustees. On occasion, this can be off-putting for people to put their name forward. You do need to rotate the directors. I know in many cases, you would have maybe a very competent group of people that will establish a company and run it very, very well and very cleanly, and it works very well. But then maybe there's a change of the guard. In a few years' time, there's rotation and new directors come on, and maybe things have potential to change. So current secretary and current people will not always be there. And I suppose a slightly different skill set is required, in my opinion, for someone to sit on a PPN secretariat that is self-hosting, and ultimately they would take on the role possibly of a company director, as opposed to those that would sit on the secretariat of an organisation that delegates the host requirement to a third party, whether that's a third party organisation or whether it is a local authority. So the third one then is a third party host. I suppose some of the pros of that: an existing governance structure similar to local authority, only it's a CLG company. Security for staff, I suppose, I'm not sure. Some people will argue yes, some people will say no. No company returns to be done by the actual PPN themselves. They're done by the third party host. Health and safety and other requirements and the governance requirements ultimately are delegated and bought in. So the third party host is paid a fee to do this. And the PPN secretariat primarily, its function will be to carry out the day-to-day operations of the PPN, advocacy, representation, training, policy change, etc., rather than there will be no, I suppose, distraction in terms of running a company. In terms of cons, again, similar to the local authority one, there is definitely this perceived issue of independence and control. If you get a third party involved, that they will take some of the control from you. And again, I'll talk later about SLAs and MOUs. That shouldn't be the case, but in practice, it probably is in some cases. Again, relationships need to be managed because you're dealing with a third party. One issue I found when I was working with some of the PPNs around the country when they were going through a host change process is in some areas there's maybe limited availability of a competent or suitable local organisation to undertake this function. If that is the case, possibly you have a problem there because you do need somebody willing to take it. This is not a large money-making exercise. It's not very lucrative being a host for a PPN. I've seen the figures. No disrespect to those who set the budgets, but the fact is, this is not a big money-making exercise. It's not something a private company would be interested in doing. And a CLG company would only do this if they have a heart for it and they have the best interests of their county or whatever or area at heart. The final thing I would say in terms of the cons is that I've come across this on a couple of occasions. If somebody is in a third-party host company, for example, if it's a charity in a particular county or local development company or whatever the case may be, there can be discrepancies in remuneration between other staff that are sitting in the same office as them or sitting in the office beside them, and this can lead to a little bit of angst and different terms and conditions, different numbers of different holiday pay. Or different terms and conditions in terms of annual leave, etc., and remuneration and salary scales, because PPN is a different funding structure. So that's something that can raise its head as well. So look, I'm looking at all three of those. I suppose there's none of them the perfect model, but just that is a very brief, I suppose, consideration. Key things then to look at in terms of considering your own circumstances, particularly those of you that are in a county or in an area that is considering change. I suppose I would suggest you ask yourself a number of questions. Is the current arrangement working? And if not, why not? Can it be fixed, repaired, or reset? And I would always suggest that that is the first port of call, to try and adjust or repair what is broken with the current arrangement. In some cases, differences will be unfortunately irreconcilable, and there will be a need for a full reset or a change of hosting arrangements. From my experience, and I deal with issues of, I suppose, dispute, conflict, differences of opinion between various different parties on a monthly basis. And to be quite honest, this comes down to relationships and managing relationships, and also competencies of people in carrying out their role, and also demarcation of roles and responsibilities, that there's a lack of clarity, that somebody is to do X, Y, and Z, somebody else is to do something else, and people are not performing their functions. And on occasion as well, as in life, some people just do not get on. And if you get two of those on different sides of an equation, that can be very unsettling. And all you need is one or two people that have very strong difference of opinion with others in a hosting arrangement, and that can lead to division and change is required. But look at your current hosting arrangement. If it's not working, why not? Can it be fixed, repaired, reset? And in some cases, you may need to take in an external person, mediator, facilitator, whatever the case may be, to actually, I'm not going to say bang heads together. We don't do that in PPN world, but to get people to come to the table and through a negotiated sort of arrangement, come to some agreement that people can work with. We're all in the same team here. This is a volunteer-led movement, and I think it's very, very important that that is taken into account when basically sorting out issues that need to be considered. People are given their time, and there's thousands of hours given on a weekly basis by people into PPNs, and I don't think that needs to be underestimated. So other things to consider are the relevant safeguards in place to ensure seamless hosting arrangements. So we spoke about this earlier, in that in terms of the independence in particular one, there should be memos of understanding, there should be SLAs, which are service level agreements. I'll explain the difference between them in a moment. But basically, where there is a third party involved, if they are written properly, if they are signed up to properly, and if they are implemented properly, technically, things should work in a relatively seamless manner. From my experience, there are SLAs, there are MOUs. People come on to either maybe a local authority into management, or come on to a PPN secretariat. They either haven't read them, or they don't understand them, or they don't implement them, or they have to find them, they're covered in dust. And they're there for a reason. They're not some piece of bureaucracy the department thought up to make your life miserable. They're there to provide a safeguard to make your life better and to make everybody's life better. Key consideration, as I said earlier, regular communication and engagement, clear demarcation of roles. So in other words, who is to do what. And when you have changes of officers or secretariat or change of staff in a local authority or a third-party host, talk to each other, have regular meetings, communicate. Prevention is better than cure. And the vast majority of issues, myself and other people like me around the country end up intervening relating to most, if not everything, could have been prevented. But the people or the safeguards weren't in place, or the will wasn't there. And there has to be a spirit of generosity and a spirit as to what the PPN stands for to making things work as well. So in terms of service level agreements and MOUs, they must be in place at all times. There are departmental requirements depending on what hosting arrangement you have. And I suppose they avoid future conflicts over responsibilities and duties as well. A memo of understanding, an SLA, what's the difference? So a memo of understanding, so if you have a third-party host, for example, a memo of understanding is required between local authority and the PPN in respect of any current year. And then a service level agreement is required between the host organisation and the PPN, and a service level agreement between local authority and the host organisation. So what's the difference? The service level agreement is ultimately a contract for service. A service level agreement is used widely in I suppose, the semi-state sector and also in the local development sector in terms of provision of services under contract. It's like a contract for services. When I tender for a piece of work and I sign the contract, it's ultimately the same as an SLA. A memorandum of understanding is not legally binding. A service level agreement is legally binding. And usually, wherever money transfers hands and moves from one entity to another, it's going to be a service level agreement because there is a paper trail, an audit trail, and a legal accountability that comes with it. So that's the difference between an SLA and an MOU. There are samples and templates of both of those that have been well refined over the years, widely available within the PPN network across the country, and the department has access to those as well if anybody's looking for them. Just, I suppose, in relation to the third-party hosting arrangements, a lot of questions around that, and ultimately, responsibilities of the employer are delegated to the host, whether that's a local authority or it's a third-party organisation. Okay. In terms of roles, and again, this is where a lot of, I suppose, muddled views arise, is the host would act as the employer. They would have legal responsibility under the health and welfare of staff to provide office facility for which the PPN operates, to process the payroll, make returns to revenue, etc. They're all administrative functionalities and legally accountable and responsible functionalities. But staff report ultimately to a designated officer of the host in regards to, I suppose, the hosting arrangements. And from an employment law point of view, they are an employee and they are responsible under Health and Safety of Work Act, etc. However, and this is where the problem arises in many cases, on a day-to-day basis, the staff members need to work closely with the staff liaison committee of the PPN. And I've come across countless cases where that is not happening. And, very easy to happen. But that's where the issue in terms of, or what I found a lot of the issues in terms of accountability and in terms of independence tend to start. Support workers, line managed and directed by resource workers, a direct report. So there's no issue in relation to staff at that level. In terms of staff policies and procedures, they're ultimately handled by the host organisation. They're agreed with the PPN secretariat at the outset when you're looking at hosting arrangement. So staff handbook, policies on travel, mobile phone use, performance appraisals, all those sorts of things are included in the staff handbook of the host organisation, not the PPN. And ultimately, there's a need as part of a hosting appointment process, if you went down this route, to basically look at that. It's not the responsibility of the PPN secretariat, but agreement at the outset. So it's important that these things are agreed at the beginning, rather than in the middle when something goes wrong, you find out, well, look, we don't agree with that particular policy in terms of leave or in terms of travel or time in lieu or whatever the case may be. Those need to be hammered out at the outset. And again, this is not reinventing the wheel. This has been done very effectively by some PPNs nationwide, and there's no excuse, I suppose, for it really to happen, but it does. I suppose in terms of dealing with the staff, there's a need to provide support and guidance from a secretariat point of view. Don't micromanage. It's an oversight role. These staff are qualified, competent people. I've met a lot of them around the country. There are some very good people working in the sector. And there's ultimately a lead-in period when you get new staff, not bombarding them with 1,000 projects and they completely are overwhelmed and walk out the door. There's a need to develop a good working relationship and be realistic in terms of work plans, etc., and keep channels of communication open. I suppose the flat structure does present, from my perspective, some challenges in terms of managing the staff, because flat structure, you don't have a hierarchy, but you do have that subcommittee of the secretariat, and that is the go-to contact for the PPN staff. So HR subcommittee between the host and the secretariat, if you went down this particular route of a third-party host, should meet quarterly, and then a programme management committee between local authority host and the secretariat would also meet quarterly. It could, in practice, and I know in real terms, it can be the same committee with joint meetings with the council joining, programme management, the items element of the meeting, rather than having two sets of meetings, and you want to keep it as seamless as possible. In terms of grievances, discipline, etc., ultimately, if there's a grievance with staff and you have third-party host, refer to the host, to the employer as such, because under employment law, they are liable, and the secretariat is not the employer by law. So this is where I suppose the landscape gets a little bit clouded for some people. The secretariat is not the employer, but the staff on a day-to-day basis, ultimately through the hosting arrangement, report to and work for the secretariat. Okay, so we're going to talk for a few moments around host selection process. There was a number of queries come in, and before I do this, I just answer one that came in from a number of you, and it was about what's the best structure. Okay, so that's maybe a poison question to answer, but I'm going to answer my view on it anyway. The department might be scared when I do, but basically, from my point of view, I've worked with all three, and I think all three can work very well when things are going well. But ultimately, from my point of view, in terms of the one that has worked maybe the best in terms of the least issues, although I'm sure they're having issues somewhere, the third-party host one for me has been very, very effective, or the local authority one. The self-hosting one, there are a number of groups doing it very well around the country, but due to the additional requirements that PPN members or secretariat members are required to undertake in terms of company law, in terms of charity trustee registration, and also there is the thing of the flat structure versus the hierarchical structure. A company is not a flat structure. And, there is, in real terms, by design, people will have to be appointed as designated directors of a company. And I've seen issues arise there in relation to the flat structure and decision making. In a company, you do not have a flat structure. You're not supposed to have anyway. So I'm just going to talk for a moment about host selection process guidance. So we'll come back to the different options later. So host selection process guidance, if you were doing a process in terms of looking for a host, I think that, everybody without question would agree it needs to be a public, transparent and open process. And it would be publicly advertised. There would be a scoring process, and that ultimately within your structure, the only decision-making body you have is the plenary, and following a scoring process, the results would be presented by the secretary to a plenary for approval, and that's it. And even the process itself, in my opinion, needs to be presented to the plenary for approval to ensure the plenary are happy with it. This is just an indicative process. I've been involved in a few of these around the country, and we replicated some good processes and maybe changed them slightly as well. And membership of the selection panel typically would consist of a member of PPN secretariat, member of local authority, and possibly an independent person to provide balance to that. Okay, and they would assess proposal using an agreed set of criteria to present to the secretariat and to the plenary. So suggested essential criteria. This isn't an exact science, but this is what I've used in the past. In terms of essential criteria, I've listed 7. And these are kind of pre-qualifications. So ultimately, you're putting out a call for expressions of interest. It's like a tender for someone to carry out a particular function for a fixed period of time for a fee and to act as your employer of your staff. So number 1, located and registered as a company within the PPN operational area. Fairly straightforward. CLG company status, CRA registered. CRO returns are up to date. They're registered already as an employer. They have an existing office space in the PPN operational area, and also they present a clean set of accounts, and they are solvent, that they have some money in the bank. They don't have to be very rich, but they have to show a degree of financial integrity. Okay, and if a party presents to be considered and they don't meet any of these, in my opinion, they would be disqualified from the competition. So this is pre-qualification criteria, we call it. And then when it comes into actually looking at the actual criteria then that you would score, this is like, you could say almost like a commercial tender, and you want to award based on certain criteria. We talk about meet criteria, most economically advantageous tender. So meet, you're talking about a combination of price and a combination of other key characteristics that you feel are important. I've divided these 20, 20, 20, 20% for each. You can, of course, weight them and change them based on the plenary and the Secretariat's own views. But I suppose just very quickly go down through them. Number one, organisation demonstrates a background, a community involved activity in the local authority administrative area. Okay, very straightforward. And then there's a few things there in terms of questions you can ask to probe that further. And these would be inserted as part of maybe a questionnaire for those parties that are putting forward a proposal. They would give answers and allow them 500 words or whatever. You don't want 50 pages of writing. Give them a finite amount of space. Second one is the organisation must demonstrate a knowledge of and a willingness to support ongoing development of the PPN. And again, they would describe how they would do that and what they understand the PPN's function is, its independence, etc. Organisation must demonstrate capacities, such as financial management, human resources, technical capacities, etc. And again, there's a number of key questions there you can ask as well. Okay. So the organisation must be able to demonstrate provision of suitable accommodation, so they have office space and adequate office space for whatever workers you have, and that there's parking, there's accessibility, and preferably meeting rooms as well, that if staff want to come and meet maybe with Secretariat or meet with other people, they don't have to leave the building, that they can do that in-house. And then the final one obviously is value for money. And again, you have a budget. And I think, in most cases, people will actually outline what the budget is or give an indication of what the budget band is, because you have a little bit of discretion as to. So ultimately, the wages of the staff will be paid and channeled through the host, as will the others, but there will be a management fee, and usually an all-in fee is what would be looked at in terms of office rent, administrative duties, etc. And this would be, you would agree to pay it maybe on a quarterly or 6 monthly basis, or whatever the case may be. But you need to list off the extensive list of things you require. Possibly you have phone paid separately, whatever the case may be. But again, that's the more you can have on a single contract, that means you have fixed costs. And as a PPN Secretariat and as a plenary, you know what you're going into on an annual basis. Okay, so that's just an indicative criteria, not suggesting you use this verbatim, but for those who have been asking and didn't know where to start, here's a good place to start. This has been used the last 2 times I used this. It resulted in successful appointment of a host organisation. Okay, so just to summarise some of the key points we've covered, again, to stress, if the current arrangements are working, there's most certainly no need to change. I am not saying there's any perfect model. Each of them have got flaws, and each of them have potential to fail based on the variety of factors that we have mentioned earlier, such as relationships, approaches, etc. Just to stress, sound like a broken record, manage your relationships between people within your own PPN Secretariat, between those that you're working with, whether it's a local authority or a host organisation or whatever. You need to work with it. I say it's like a marriage. You need to work at it from day one. If you don't, you're not going to end up in a very good place. Clear demarcation of duties. Again, measure twice and cut once. Very explicitly state what the roles and responsibilities are of each party and ensure that they are enforced and there are regular meetings and updates. And keep your staff informed and keep them in the loop. Upskill, I suppose, when key people change in the host, the local authority or the PPN Secretariat, whichever apply to you as well. Because what I found is when there's a change of the guard, usually in the 6 to 12 months after that, is when the wheel can start to get squeaky and very squeaky, basically, in some cases. So look, Eva, I'm going to stop talking. I think that's the last slide, and we'll go to questions and answers. And I see a lot of comments coming in there as I was speaking. I was trying not to be distracted by looking at them, but more than happy to answer any questions that I can. Again, I'm not an absolute authority on this. Many of you have been involved in PPNs for years and have a great deal of knowledge and expertise, and we want to hear from you as well.
Thanks very much, Alan. I think Gillian's been keeping track of the questions and might start feeding now, Gillian, if that's all right, the various ones.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. We did get this question in earlier on. So we had some questions about how staff are involved in the process. So, Alan, how do you think staff should be involved in the decision-making process when changing hosts?
Okay, right. Well, look, in terms of staff, my view on that's very, very clear. I think staff, as a matter of courtesy, need to be consulted. I think having it totally independent from staff is basically an oversight. Staff are, and again, if you look at roles and responsibilities, you have a flat structure, but you have staff that are servicing that flat structure. Staff bring with them a lot of expertise, skills, etc. But you don't want to tail wagging the dog either. And I mean that with respect for the staff members that are present on the call. The role of the plenary and the secretariat is to decide policy. The role of staff is to implement it. That does not mean they should not have a voice. I think they should be consulted, definitely as a matter of courtesy, and their views need to be taken into consideration and seriously by the secretariat and the plenary when looking at the different options and views. But staff's view is to implement policy, not decide it.
Thanks very much, Alan. I know you kind of touched on this question before, but I'll just ask you again. Based on your experience, which option do you believe secures the future of the PPN best?
Yeah, look, to be quite honest, and again, this is purely from my experience of being a voluntary director. I think over the years, I've been a voluntary director on 14 CLG companies, and I'm still on a couple of them. And, you know, the onerous, there's an increasing, I suppose, onerous requirement on people who are company directors in terms of reporting, accountability, trustees, etc., of charities and reporting and regulation. And it's not for everybody. I don't mind it. It doesn't bother me at all. I'm used to doing it. But there are some very good people who will volunteer and get involved in their PPN and get involved in secretariats who do not want to be company directors. The second thing as well is I think that, you're not going to get additional money for doing your own accounts or doing all the various different functions yourself. If you go down the route of a host, from my experience, again, there's probably exceptions to this around the country, it's probably more cost effective to share overheads such as accountancy, etc., if they're done within a host organisation, whether that's a local authority or whether that's a third party host. My own big preference, and again, I do a lot of work for local authorities around the country, but my own preference is a third party host if you can get a good one. The problem is there are certain counties, I think, that probably maybe a struggle to get a suitable third party host. I've seen over the years you have, as well as that, when you go out to tender, you may have an organisation that is, based in one small part of the county, a geographic organisation, a very effective one, maybe a community enterprise group or a social enterprise or something like that, and they're very keen to do this. Local parish politics comes into it in terms of appointment. Ideally, if you're going for a third-party host, try and get something that is county-wide coverage, like volunteer centre company or local development company or something like that, because that takes to an extent the politics out of it. The only one thing I will say about doing a competition, if you are doing a competition, do it by the book, because if there's any grey areas or room for questioning decision making, it can leave people with a bad taste in their mouths. And any competitive process will lead to winners and losers, and that's just not a consideration. But just to answer the question, the third party host, for me, from my experience, is the preferable local authority one after that. Again, I know there are 3 or 4 probably at least doing the self-hosting, and they're working very well, and well done to those who are doing that. I feel it's an exception rather than a rule, but that's only my view.
Thanks, Alan. I think Anne-Marie, you have the next question.
I'll move on. I'm just having a look in the chat box there, and there is plenty of questions coming in and some good comments as well. There's one question from Linda Ennis asking about where a PPN is considering moving from the local authority as host to an external host. What are the implications for the employment status of the staff?
I would suggest there may be issues there because, if staff are employed within local authority, I'm sure, and again, I'm just saying it out loud here, in terms of progression and employment prospects within a large organisation such as a local authority, they probably wouldn't like leaving. And if I was them, I wouldn't like leaving as well, and just say it straight. I think there is, and again, I don't know the county and I don't want to, But I would say, without question, there would be fear of losing them. If they can get a full-time job in the local authority, they'll stay there and they'll stay put. If they can't, or if they're very passionate about PPN, they would move with it. But in terms of terms and conditions of employment and security of tenure, you would feel as a staff member there's more security in local authority. Whether there is or not is another thing.
Thanks, Ellen. With regard, a question from Aveen. With regards to staff benefits like sick leave, maternity leave, are external hosts responsible for funding of this?
Okay, well, this actually came up. One of the areas I was working in, where there was a move, and it wasn't from a local authority, but it was a move from one host to another, a third-party host. And I suppose the department have provided. I've seen in one case, and again, my department can provide clarity again on this, but ultimately there was a special fund established, and some PPN resources and money was put into that fund to allow for future, for example, redundancy, entitlements, etc. Because, you know, if you take on, and particularly if you have a third-party host, if you take on someone who's been an employee for 5 years, and as a minimum under statutory redundancy, once you go over 104 weeks of paid employment, which is 2 years continuous employment, you're entitled to 2 weeks redundancy per year, plus one. So if you're 2 years employed, you're entitled to five weeks wages. Okay, if you're 10 years, you're basically entitled to 21 weeks wages. So there is a legacy under transfer of undertaking. There is a legacy, I suppose, liability for a new host in taking on an existing employee. And for the existing employee, there is obviously a concern that historical entitlements, there are safeguards in relation to that as well. In relation to the other aspects of holiday pay and sick leave, etc., I think that's a matter for negotiation and sitting down to host and hammering that out. It depends what they are. I don't think there's complete uniformity around the country. From what I've seen, actually no, there isn't, and that in itself is an issue. So I think, not fudging the question, but I think in terms of entitlements, other entitlements aside from redundancy, which is a statutory requirement, a new host has to abide by. The others, I think, need to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And if there are historical legacy issues there, they're going to have to be tried and negotiated and addressed with the employee, because the employee ultimately is transferring a contract employment from one organisation to another, and there's employment law legislation governing that.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I see a comment in there from Gareth, which probably was enforced by yourself or kind of reinforced by yourself there earlier, Alan, was it's, the emphasis on a very good, strong MOU or SLA will ensure a smooth relationship with the local authority, and with the council, ensures good relationships.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in with a question there, sorry, Anne-Marie, because somebody asked, is it possible to have help from the department in negotiating the MOU? So I don't know if somebody from the department wants to answer that.
I think Aoife is just off the call now at the moment. Okay. So, as you know, I'm only brand new into PPN, so I'm not going to answer that one.
No, that's okay.
Ciara, are you on?
I'll take that
Ciara,
one. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Ciara.
Yeah, look, the department has a support service in place with the Wheel. And there's a huge amount of supports available in terms of governance, financial, all the rest. So certainly I'd speak to the Wheel. There's a certain number of hours allocated to each PPN in the country. There's 30. So I'd advise you to speak to the Wheel, talk about your governance structures, have them look at your MOUs and your SLAs. Are they fit for purpose? Do they do what you want them to do? And back to something that Alan emphasised really strongly earlier on, does it provide the adequate demarcation between roles and responsibilities of each party as well, so that there's no crossover? Because sometimes I think, and listening to Alan, and knowing the vast experience that he has, sometimes a lot of conflict or confusion or relationship angst does come from not understanding what your role and your responsibility is. So I think having those really strong MOUs and SLAs are really important. But the Wheel support service is there and will provide that advice to PPNs where you are negotiating MOUs and SLAs at the moment, or just even to revise them and have a look at the ones that you have in place. Are they fit for purpose? Do they do what you need to do? Are there any issues, grey issues that need to be clarified or strengthened in the MOU? They're supposed to be, the ones with the local authorities are supposed to be reviewed every year. So look, I'd take the opportunity and use the services of the Wheel that are available to all the PPNs to review them. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much, Ciara. I have another one in here. What should a PPN do if the staff try to lead the Secretariat to a preferred host option?
Okay, I'll answer that.
Thank you.
I think they need to perform their function. The function of the Secretariat is to act on behalf of the plenary and provide guidance and direction to the organisation. And this comes down to demarcation of duties. I don't blame some staff for having a particular preference in terms of security, tenure of employment, or terms and conditions of employment. But what I would say is, as with any staff member, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in the government department, or whether it's in the community and voluntary sector or PPN, staff's position and staff are there to perform a function and to support the organisation. And there is a line that I would suggest staff should not cross over. Yes, actively engage with when asked to do so, and in relation to any debate or discussion. But ultimately, staff are, and I'm sorry, but staff are policy takers, not policy makers. The policy makers are the plenary, guided by the Secretariat. But please, I suppose, do take into account what has led in some cases to angst and issues between staff of PPNs and secretaries and plenaries is staff being ignored, their view not being taken into consideration. I think at the very outset of a process such as this, the very first people that need to be consulted with are the staff, because their livelihoods and their commitment and energy they put into the job for whatever period of time, and that's out of courtesy. That's just pure humanity, never mind any procedure. But most certainly, advice, exercise your authority. The staff, the tail doesn't wag the dog. And that doesn't mean you have to get very hot and heavy. It means there has to be just a fairly direct conversation had by members of the Secretariat with the staff member, not in the public forum, as to what their role is, and that their requirement to, I suppose, to basically comply with the wishes of the plenary. There are the issue that does raise its head from time to time and has been mentioned. I've dealt with cases in this, is the issue of constructive dismissal, where people have said, well, look, changing the host and I'm being forced out of a job because I don't want to go to this new host or whatever the case may be. In most cases, that's unfounded, because as the employer and as the conduit through which the funding is coming, there is a mechanism accommodating that, and it's a matter of sitting down to staff members and see, in practical terms, can some of their fears be allayed? Some of them can't, I'm sure, but again, it's a common sense approach. But exercise your authority.
Can I just come in there as well, Gillian, if you don't mind?
Of course, Ciara, yeah.
Just to again, not repeat what Alan said, which are very important points, but just also something that Alan mentioned in his presentation on the template that he gave for selection of a hosting organisation, or how you go about evaluating and doing your pre-qualifying questions, etc. That's a really important part. And if your process is strong and robust enough, nobody should be able to influence how that decision is made and how you select a host organisation. So putting a very strong process in place from the outset will ensure that nobody not one individual can influence that selection process. So again, your process and defining your process, setting it out is so important. Having the conversations with all parties involved, deciding what your process is, and then following your process to the latter should not allow for any undue influence from any party.
Thanks a million, Ciara.
Now, I just have
Anne-Marie has some more.
Yeah, I'm on mute there. That's great. Let me see. Okay, there's a question from Naomi asking to clarify the CLG. Does it need to be audited or not? And if the CLG doesn't raise money, etc., so surely it shouldn't be needing to be registered with the charity. Would that thinking be right? Would you think?
It depends. Look, some CLG companies, depending on their memo of arts of association and their key objectives, the charity regulator has rules whereby if you meet certain criteria, you have to become registered. There are plenty of CLG companies. The person who asked the question is quite right. There are plenty of CLG companies that are not registered with the charity regulator. Most of those are economic enterprises. So in other words, they are generating significant amounts of money and they're operating as a community-based enterprise. There are a number of those do not need to register with the charity regulator. Most that don't fall into that category are, look, to answer your question, depends what you put in your memo and arts of association and what the other functions of the group will be. The benefits of being registered with the charity regulator probably are limited, but the fact of the matter is, if you're handling a certain amount of public money, there is a requirement there as well. So again, I don't have the guidelines to hand here. I should have had them to hand. I don't have them to hand, but you need to get just guidance on that. If the wheel is providing a support service, they helped write the regulations from the charity. I know Deirdre Garvey, who's now gone, was on the steering group that actually looked at all of that. So they'll be able to tell you directly whether you have to or don't have to be registered with the charity regulatory authority. It's not the end of the world. Getting registered is the worst bit. The annual return takes you 10-15 minutes. It's not a big onerous undertaking. But you're right, CLGs do not have to be registered with the charity regulator authority if they meet certain criteria.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just trying to run through the questions here. There was a question earlier if the slides will be shared, and I think you mentioned that, Alan, that they will, that everybody will get a copy of the slides. And as we mentioned, we're recording as well, so it should be available as well on the website.
I'll jump in with a question quickly, sorry, because I know we're coming up to, the time finishing. In a hosted scenario, who sets staff wages conditions? The employer or the secretariat, who develops the budget with the plenary, especially if the secretariat want to give conditions to their staff that the third party don't usually grant to other staff?
Well, look, that's, in my mind, that's an easy enough one. It's the secretariat will agree the terms and conditions of employment that will be applied to the hosting arrangement. It will be nobody else. At the end of the day, money that comes through the department will go to local authority, in turn then will be channeled to the hosting organisation on a 3-monthly or 6-monthly or whatever the arrangement might be. But in terms of how the PPN budget is spent in its entirety, that is a matter for the plenary, and in turn the PPN secretariat will provide guidance on that, not a third-party host. Third-party host will have staff manual of terms and conditions of employment. And these are all things that need to be included in terms of a specification when you're going out to look for a hosting arrangement. And prior to signing off that SLA contract for services with a third-party host, these are the exact things that need to be hammered out. A third-party host can't go off and spend 1 cent of PPN money without the authority of the PPN. Plain and simple.
We've another question there. Is the department forming a preference for what scenario works best? Ciara, I think.
If they have, they haven't told me, but I've given my one.
Sorry,
would Ciara be
okay
there?
Yeah, I can come in. I can come in there. Yeah. I think I think Alan has kind of given the pros and cons of each one. We don't have a preference, but we have seen the challenges and the difficulties and the legal issues that have arisen from PPNs that have set up with CLG. So one of the things that we are looking for, where PPNs are looking to go down that route, is to have a business case presented to the department that sets out the roles, responsibilities, the structure for the company, how it works with the secretariat, etc. Because one thing that we need to be confident of in the department is that the structure and the right structures and the understanding and the expertise and the competencies are in place within the PPNs to hold to become a company structure. And again, I think Alan made a very important point in his pros and cons is that you may have really good people in place for a certain amount or finite period, but when they move on, do you have the right people coming in behind them to take over those roles and responsibilities? Some people do this. It's second nature to them. It's simple. And we've really good examples of PPNs that work as companies. Tipperary has from the outset. So I would speak to them. But one thing I would say is that the department needs to be very confident that the structures, the competencies, etc., are in place, and the understanding of the roles and responsibilities of becoming a company and company directors, etc., that understanding is in place within PPNs before we would approve a decision for a PPN to set up as a company.
Thanks so much for that. This question came in twice, so I might just say it, and we might have to wrap up very soon after it. Is this a legitimate topic that can be considered by a PPN? How would you view the local authority that unilaterally postpones a recruitment process for a long-term vacant resource worker while the PPN considers the questions of hosting?
That sounds like a very strange position. You have two funders in PPNs, to the best of my knowledge. One is the department, one is the local authority. And, that is one of the funders. I take it there's either a budgetary issue or there's some underlying issue behind that question, obviously, or that decision. Otherwise, it would sound unreasonable. So I think maybe a little bit more background information on that, and that ultimately is not a sustainable position where you have a PPN without a worker or workers and a resource which is required, because I know the workload of the staff that are working in PPNs, and it's significant. And, I think that one possibly, I might suggest, needs to be examined by the department.
I'll just come in there again and just, as Alan said, without knowing the background and where to get, I suppose, the issues behind the question. If a PPN hasn't made a decision or has indicated that they might be changing their hosting arrangement away from a local authority, I think I could understand why a local authority wouldn't go out to recruit staff for that position, because then they're left holding, or they're left with a position in the local authority that isn't funded, and they don't have the salary to pay it if they're moving outside, because the person mightn't, depending on the contract, if they're a local authority employee, mightn't move under 2Pay with the PPN. So I think there is underlying complications here, or questions that need to be asked. So I think it would really fall, if there is an issue, look, come and talk to the department. But also I think you need to sit down with your local authority, because if you signalled that you're moving away from the local authority, I think I can understand where their reluctance would be to carry out a recruitment process that would give them an employee. So I think it's more complicated than just asking that question. I think there's a lot of underlying questions there. But look, if there is somebody who's facing that problem, come and talk to us. We're more than happy to work with you on it.
Yeah, there's just one. There was someone had asked a question there, and I didn't entirely answer it. I see it popping up in the chat again. Apologies. Just in relation to the query about CLG companies, do they need to be audited or not? The fact is there is a thing called audit exemption, which is available for CLG companies, but they have to apply for it. Okay, so it's ultimately, if someone is doing an audit, their accountant hasn't applied or they don't meet the conditions to apply for audit exemption. So that's the plain and simple answer for that. If they have an accountant that can apply for audit exemption and they meet the criteria for audit exemption, they won't need to be audited.
Alan, thanks so much. I know that we're going over time now. So Anne-Marie, I don't know if you have any more questions. I think you're on mute, Anne-Marie, sorry.
I just had to look through the chat there. I think we are probably over time now, and I don't know if Ciara or Aoife are online and would like to say a few words before we close off.
Ciara, I know you're there, so I hope I'm not speaking on top of you, but just wanted to say thank you very much again to Alan and to everyone who has attended this evening. I think we have probably a good few questions in the chat that we will look through afterwards. Hopefully we've covered most of them. If not, we can compile an FAQ document and we will make that available to everyone. We will also, as I think we've said, put a copy of the recording on our website and make a copy of Alan's slides available as well that way. And we'll get that link once it's up. We hope to do that as soon as possible. We'll get that link out to you as soon as we can. So just to wrap up again by saying thank you very much to Alan for what I think was a very useful seminar. And thank you all again for attending.